Some called it Judgment Day, some called it Armageddon. It took a while before anyone called them zombies. We just didn't want to face the truth, I think. Murder happens all the time. Even vicious, brutal murders hardly rate a headline in the morning news these days. A few random murders, however grisly, didn't really arouse concern at first. As a society, we had become largely inoculated against such brutality. Daily, it seemed, our child was taken, sometimes found raped, sometimes found murdered, and more nefariously, some would claim, never found at all. We told ourselves it had happened somewhere else. It had happened to someone else. Never here, never to us. But sometimes it did. It had become a backdrop to our waking lives. The milk carton kids had been replaced by the walls of the missing in the vestibules of the big box stores. Rarely did anyone pause to look, but for those missing people, life was an excruciating exercise in stasis. Always waiting to hear of news or breaks in the case, unable to breathe, unable to move. But there was always hope. People clung to hope against astronomical odds that their loved ones would be found. After all, several children, some now adults, had been recovered following an escape or a rescue. Their tales of captivity were dire. However, who could argue that they would prefer never to know than to have them back? But it gave false hope to millions and prolonged the agony of the bereaved. Hanging on was a kind of living death in itself. Then the reports started coming in. It began as a trickle, which quickly grew to a flood of sightings coming into 911, America's Most Wanted, call centers, police stations, radio stations, to whoever would listen. This child or that woman was spotted. I can't be sure, but she was definitely wearing the same clothes as on the posters. And it can't be him after all these years, but it looks just like him. Servers crashed, operators were overwhelmed, and there was widespread disbelief. At first. But soon enough the evidence mounted. It was impossible, it was incredible, but however you cut it, there was no denying that missing people, many presumed dead from all over the world, had come back. People tried to approach them, but the zombies were unresponsive to discourse. So many people had come back that people took to calling them the returned instead of zombies. They were the lost ones, the ones we hoped would be recovered alive, but never really believed they would be. They had come back, but they weren't the same. They were filthy and lethargic. They didn't, or couldn't, interact with others or their surroundings. They seemed disconnected from the world. None of them spoke, nor showed any recognition of those around them. In fact, they didn't seem to communicate in any way. They were unnerving in their catatonia, and although they seemed to have a destination in mind, whether or not they actually had a mind was debatable. Yeah, they had come back, and they seemed to have somewhere to go, for no placations or pleas in the living would stay them from their journey for long. They would eventually amble on, inexplorable and unwavering, shuffling towards destinations unknown. Something had returned, but what these things were, what they wanted, was a mystery. But they were not the people we knew. They were alien and alienated, foreign to our hearts, and they carried the odor of rot about them. From shallow graves and swamps they rose. Some clawed their way from cemeteries and churchyards. From vast fields and shuttered basements they came. Somehow they had become imbued with a powerful, unnatural will to seek out something, or someone. It was truly terrifying to see them shuffling up the highway or down the lane, doggedly pressing on to untold destinations. And then the first reports that they were killing came in. They were not the flesh-crazed, slavering automatrons, hungering endlessly for entrails and brains as envisioned by Romero. The returns showed little interest in consuming those they killed. Their main objective was clearly just to kill. There was substantial evidence of ripping and chewing, but it was most likely the result of the returned having only their hands and teeth as weapons. There were no indications that they consumed what they killed. Mastication was a means to an end. They did not kill indiscriminately. They were very specific about who lived and who died. Among those targeted by the returned were policemen, politicians, lawyers, teachers, movie stars, mechanics, convicted pedophiles. They were from virtually every walk of life. They seemed to share no common denominator, although they were almost exclusively male. Most of the victims were pillar of the community types, but nothing seemed to connect them. It was a popular television host who put forth the first tentative guesses at what lay behind the mystery of the returned and those they selected to die. He knew the meaning of loss and tragedy better than nearly anyone, and it was he, and his dark adapted eye, who saw past the veneer of legitimacy of these men and a few women and began to connect the dots. It was this icon of the missing, speaking from retirement, who ventured the first credible theory for the gruesome deaths at the hands of the dead. His proclamation was met with a dubious reception. He was vindicated, however, with a little help from a journalist and a blogger who had illegally accessed the National Criminal Database and obtained a list of accused and convicted of sex crime suspects, and it was he who presented the overwhelming evidence that the targets of the returned were most likely responsible for their murders. Panic ensued. Hordes of men swamped the police stations, confessing to unsolved, or in some cases, unknown, murders, sometimes confessing to crimes in which someone else had been convicted, confessing to anything they could think of, all with one stipulation: immediate remand. Jails had become the last refuge of the guilty. Prisons seemed to be the only truly safe place for the wicked. And then even those safe havens began to fail. There were rumors that there were guards who didn't fight too hard to keep the Return from gaining entrance, and there were a whisper or two of complicity. After it was realized that the Return weren't being indiscriminate in their retribution, more and more of them, accidentally, made their way into max security wards. How they gained entrance to electronically locked cells is anyone's guess, although one fact is indisputable: those tasked with the imprisonment of criminals may also have had friends or relatives who were victims of evil, and are not necessarily opposed to a little justice being meted out on their behalf. In the beginning, there was fear and panic and mayhem, but once it became apparent that the Returned were not attacking at random, indeed could not be provoked into violence at all, not even when savage themselves, we began to relax a little bit. As time passed, we simply grew accustomed to them. We began leaving our homes and shelters, going about our business as usual, even while they shuffled ever onward. I saw one walk across the freeway once. Drivers slow to allow it to pass. They were just a part of the scenery now, no more remarkable than a rock or a tree stump. Hindering them didn't work for long. Injuring them didn't work, even shooting them didn't work. If they had so much as a single arm or leg left with which to drag themselves, they kept going. Patiently and emotionlessly, they just kept going. The old adage about getting them in the head was wrong. Some had clearly been killed via varying degrees of head trauma. Whatever force had animated them didn't seem to rely on the central nervous system or an intact cranium. We relaxed because an image seen over and over will eventually lose its power to shock or alarm, or even inspire notice. We relaxed because they seemed to be on a mission. It was a mission of revenge, and we can live with that. I think some people welcomed them. They were cleaning house, as it were, doing for us what a proper democracy could never hope to accomplish. They were unerringly administrating a biblical justice, an eye for an eye, life for a life. I think we all actually started to feel a little safer. The most insidious threats to society were being removed. The oftentimes invisible threats. They shared our homes and shared our beds. One could walk the streets at night. The Returned were a better deterrent to crime than the death penalty. Pleading couldn't save you from their justice. Money couldn't save you from their justice. It was horrifying at first, yes, but it was also satisfying. As far as we knew, they never hurt an innocent person, and they never made mistakes. But of course, eventually all good things must be interfered with by the government. The people in charge began rounding them up. What became of them after that, I don't know. But there were many, and they just kept coming. That was when the wife of the television host died, killed on camera by the headless body of her young son. John took a gun from his own bodyguard in the confusion and ended his life in a resounding bang. Not a soul could blame him. Shock and outcry were immediate. Possible explanations were more elusive. Speculation ran wild. Why her? Had she been involved in her son's death? She had never even been seriously considered a suspect. Nothing in the media had ever pointed at her, and her grief and guilt at having left him unattended, very briefly, were plaintive and wrenching. Their dramatic loss had played out across millions of televisions, and I can't name a single person who questioned her innocence. The answers came soon enough. As more and more parents of murdered children began to be taken by the Returned, it became clear that they held those who had failed to protect them as responsible as those who kidnapped and murdered them. When this unfathomable concept began to sink in, many parents of murdered or missing children took their own lives. Their fates were sealed, convicted by their own hearts long before they could be silently accused by the Returned. There was little fanfare, although there was great sympathy. Many others simply resigned themselves to the inevitable and awaited their fates. They waited on lawn chairs, on stoops, car bumpers, tire swings. They seemed to be everywhere. I never realized how many people lost children. Having been tormented by their secret failures for decades in some cases, these parents grimly and stoically welcomed their wayward child's final, toothy embrace. Across the lonely expanse of years, I've prayed that she would find her way home. I've hoped for it, I've dreaded it, knowing the horrors most children are subjected to when kidnapped. I've berated myself and hated myself, I've blamed myself, and I've blamed everyone else. I've made deals with God, and I'd make deals with the devil if I thought he could keep his end. I've fantasized about it, mentally prepared feasts and homecomings, and grave sites. I've imagined many, many scenarios, but this one never occurred to me, but it seems to fit somehow. It fits my guilt and desire to be punished. You see, I sent her out to play that day, because I was busy. Busy with chores and cooking and laundry, busy with things that don't matter at all. The only thing that ever mattered was her, and I was too preoccupied to know it. As for me, I'll wait my end in my old rocking chair. I've left the kitchen door ajar for her. For my Ruth.